Hello. So this is my first set of Bible thoughts based on the letter of 1 Peter. Liz has done all the weeks running up to this, and I'm going to do a couple now. So it's great to be able to share with you and get into 1 Peter. I know Liz has done a great job at just trying to unpack some of what that world of 1 Peter is and what does that mean for us. I find myself personally, today we're looking at 1 Peter 2 verses 11 to 17, and I find myself totally challenged when reading these verses. This is what it says. Let me read it to you. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourself to the Lord, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God and honour the emperor. I find myself really challenged by that. The title in my Bible is Living Godly Lives in a Pagan Society. What is a pagan society? Well, in the context of these verses, a pagan society simply means a non-God following society. So actually, the advice given here for how to live as Christians in a non-godly society is just as applicable now as it was then, because we now live in a non-God centered world. These verses try to give us guidelines on how, as followers of Christ, we should be living out our faith in a world that doesn't believe in the same God we do. So, as I say, whilst 2,000 years has passed, the context has changed. The outworking of how we live our lives shouldn't. I have conversations with quite a few people about the state of the world. One of the questions that I come across is the world getting worse? I'm a history student. I have a history degree. And being honest, when I look back through my historian lens, when I look back at the state of the world, when I look back at the last 2,000 years worth of history, there have been some horrific things that have happened in the last 2,000 years. In fact, some of the things that have happened over the last 2,000 years are so horrific, they make the state of the world today, in some respects, pale into insignificance in comparison. But I do understand why there is a rising sense that things feel worse today. We have access to more information from all over the world, and it's right at our fingertips. We have access to news from around the world available in your hand 24/7. I honestly don't think that things in the world are worse. I think we simply hear more and immediately more about the state of things around the world. We hear about the state of things much quicker, and we hear about things in greater detail than we ever have before. This digital age has made the idea of bad news immediate and not just localized to where we are, but about things that we have no connection to at all. It makes us feel like the world is worse, but the truth is, in my opinion, it's just as bad as it ever was, but we just hear about more of it now. So, some of the challenges that the believers faced when this letter was written 2,000 years ago, in my opinion, is not so different from the challenges we face today. And certainly the challenge of how we live out our faith in a world that doesn't believe, that challenge has not changed. Verse 11, where it started, reminds us of something that's always true about people. We have desires that aren't good for us. We all do. We all do. Admit it. We all have desires, things we want to do that aren't good for us. We have desires that come from what the Bible would call our flesh or the world. Sinful desires that aren't good for us. And when we become Christians, these desires don't necessarily go away. We are still human after all. Well, I am. Hopefully you are too. But what happens is when we become a Christian, we do, or we should have more of an awareness of these fleshly sinful desires than we had before. Verse 11 reminds us that before we wrestle with the external things of this non-believing world, we need to first be wrestling with the worldly sinful things in us, in our hearts. Because if we don't, these sinful desires in our hearts will take over our lives and lead our actions. I love the language that Peter uses here about these desires waging war with our souls. This is more than just wrestling with something. It reminds me, though, that living out my faith starts internally, starts with my battles. And my internal battles and the outcome of those will impact how I live out my faith externally for the world to see. So I feel the first challenge already from verse 11 is, are we battling and wrestling with our sinful stuff, or do we just assume that we have it all nailed? And so we're just going to try and take off on the world before we try and deal with ourselves first. I'm always reminded that the sinful desires of my heart only gratify my flesh in a moment, but the damage to my spiritual wellness will always be long term. God satisfies my soul long-term. Which do I want? Do I want momentary fleshly gratification or long-term spiritual wellness in God? Which would you choose? I'm so thankful for verse 12. In the face of a world that is so different from that of our own, the temptation can be to withdraw from the world and hide away in holy huddles with other Christians. We're reminded in verse 12 here that whilst the world is very, very different from that of God, and that we will come against opposition when we live God's way, we also shouldn't hide away from the world. That we need to be people living amongst the world. How else will God be seen unless we are living amongst the world? We need to be living out the love of God for all to see, not hidden away behind closed doors. Love always remains open. Are we? Verse 13 and 14 are sometimes easily forgotten. Living in the world as Christians doesn't mean that we ignore the rules of people in authority, the government, for example. Here in England, I can't really think of laws that means I'm expected to compromise my faith in God. Don't think there's any law which is calling me to denounce my faith in God at the moment. I may not agree to all that the government does, but provided I'm not being led by them to compromise my faith in God, these verses are clear. Living amongst the world means coming under the authority of the people who have worldly authority, our bosses, our governments. Our faith is not an excuse to create unneeded or unwarranted dissent, unless coming under worldly authority leads us to compromise our faith. We need to live as people doing good in the world under that authority of God. And that's where integrity will be maintained. Verses 15 to 17 are brilliant. And to be honest with you, I could spend ages on verses 15 to 17, but I'm not going to. I'm almost going to distill them into three very simple points, because I think these 3 points are essentially what Peter is saying living out our faith in the world looks like. Number 1, do good, no matter what other people is doing, or even saying, or even thinking. What other people do, think, and say should never, never stop us from doing good, the good of God. Number 2, respect other people, even if they don't respect you. In fact, what I've learned is that some people, when they find out about my faith, automatically show me disrespect. But the more I live with integrity, doing good, and respecting them, wins them over when they see something of God in that. Number 3, really simple. Love each other by word and deed. These are almost the simplified 3 points of living out our faith in an ungodly world. Do good regardless of what other people are doing and saying. Respect others even if they don't respect us. And love each other by word and deed. Quite simply, this is how Peter is calling us in this letter to live in the world. Ignore the other stuff. Don't let the ungodly stuff of this world stop you. Because it's an ungodly world as well. But should that stop us from being the goodness of God in this world? This world needs God. How do we show this world God? We turn up. We do good regardless. We respect others regardless. And we love people regardless. No matter how dark the world gets around us, don't stop being the light. All the light we need is given to us by God. It's found in Him who is alive in us. The challenge is, as always, will we?